What's up everyone, welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be matchmaking the entire UFC 300 card. We actually just got 3 new fight announcements in Cody Brundage versus Nickal, Aljamain Sterling versus Calvin Kattar, and Jiri Prochazka versus Aleksandar Rakic. These fights are a lot of fun. Let's go and predict them right now. So Nickal versus Cody Brundage. I'm going Nickal, round 1 finish. Cody Brundage doesn't have the greatest chin, has a very poor fight IQ, can't get taken down. I think Nickal can easily take him down, potentially hurt him on the feet. Now Cody Brundage does have power on the feet, and there is a world where he can KO Nickal, but I don't think he's going to be able to stuff the takedowns. And probably finds the submission in round 1 or TKO on the ground. Going to Sterling versus Kattar. I genuinely have not thought about this fight at all. I haven't really thought about how Aljamain Sterling does at the featherweight division yet. It's going to be fun to see. I was actually going to put this fight on my UFC 300 card builder before it was announced, so I'm glad that it was announced. It makes a lot of sense. This is a very exciting fight. Jeez, I cannot talk. And then we'll move on to Jiri versus Rakic. I hate to do this again, but I don't know who I'm going to pick here. I'm a very big Jiri Prochazka fan, so I am looking for a reason to pick him, and I will tell you this much. Rakic did get hit by some very big shots by Jan Blachowicz, and if Jiri lands those, Rakic might get hurt and he might get knocked out, but also Rakic can take down Jiri Prochazka because Jiri Prochazka's takedown defense isn't great. Now, can he scramble back up to the feet? Yes. So I don't know. Jiri Prochazka, this is likely going to be in a 3-rounder, is very, very dangerous. And sometimes he just wills his way to victories, and this could be one of those things. But Rakic does have some very good leg kicks, which makes this a super, super interesting matchup. All right, so now let's talk about matchmaking, the fights that aren't announced yet and what I think they should be. I'm going to start out by saying Dana White has said this card is going to be fun from the prelim, the first prelim, all the way to the main event. I'm going to start out from the main event all the way down from what I think the fight should be. The main event should be McGregor versus Chandler. I know some people are speculating it could even be Pereira versus Aspinall now, but if it's a title fight, the only other thing I could see it being is Pereira versus Jamal Hill, Leon Edwards versus Bilal Muhammad, or Islam versus Gaethje/Oliveira. The problem with that is it is during Ramadan, so I don't think that's going to happen. McGregor versus Chandler makes all the sense in the world. It should happen. McGregor's manager said that he's going to be pushing for the fight to happen at UFC 300. If they don't do McGregor versus Chandler for McGregor's next fight, they absolutely hoed Chandler. They put him on tough. They said he was going to get the fight. They have to do McGregor versus Chandler. Now, the co-main event is going to be Dustin Poirier versus Dan Hooker, and I'll tell you why. I understand Dan Hooker doesn't really deserve the massive jump up in the rankings, but Dustin Poirier is not going to take a fight with Arman Tsarukyan. I will tell you that right now. If he does, I 100% prefer that matchup over Dan Hooker, but I don't think that's going to be the case. You have to give Dustin Poirier a matchup that he will want to take, and this is one of those fights where the first fight was so much fun to watch. Do a co-main event, 5 rounds, make it a lot of fun to watch. I will say this much too. If Conor McGregor beats Michael Chandler, and Dustin Poirier beats Dan Hooker, they might do the 4th fight there. There's a lot of potential with what you can do. Putting them on the same timeline in the same press conference will create a lot of drama in the building, a lot of pay-per-view buys. McGregor versus Chandler, my early prediction right now is going to be Michael Chandler. And the reason is, obviously Conor McGregor has looked very good in the past, and prime Conor McGregor, I'm taking over Michael Chandler. It's just he's coming off a very long layoff. We just recently saw how it affected Colby Covington. He didn't look great, but he actually apparently broke his foot now. I don't even know how to feel about that. Anyways, Conor McGregor lands some very powerful shots. He's got some very good boxing, some very solid striking, and Michael Chandler gets hit and doesn't have the best chin. Now, Michael Chandler is very physically imposing outside of his chin. He's got a lot of power in the hands, some very powerful wrestling. Super, super strong guy. He is a dog, and the reason why I'm picking him is because Conor McGregor, I think, is doing coke. He's slamming bottles of Proper 12. We saw it at BKFC. I don't think this guy is super locked in, or maybe he just locked in. He's on steroids. He's looking a bit fat. Maybe the weight cut's even going to be harder for him. I just can't trust a guy coming off, what is it, a 2 or 3 year layoff at this point, coming off such a brutal injury to come back and beat such a great fighter, Michael Chandler, who has done nothing but think about Conor McGregor for the longest time. And although Michael Chandler has horrible fight IQ, which is why I can't trust them, and this will be a very interesting fight if no one gets the finish early, because neither one of these guys has very solid cardio, and there's going to be a massive adrenaline dump at some point in round 2 or round 3. I do think Michael Chandler gets it done maybe like round 2. This is a lot of fun on paper. Putting Dustin Poirier on the co-main event makes it a lot of fun. I would pick Dustin Poirier over Dan Hooker. He could potentially find a finish. I probably would pick him by a finish. Dan Hooker looked pretty solid. I don't want to say pretty solid. He looked decent against Jalen Turner. He did get hurt and obviously lost the first round, but then won the last 2. And he proved that he was not washed, which is always great to see. This is a very fun fight on paper. It's a very fun rematch. And although it doesn't make all the sense in the world, it's a fight that Dustin Poirier will take, and he's a guy that does deserve to be on UFC 300. So now that we've established those two fights, I'm going to move on to the next fight that I want booked, which is Kamaru Usman versus Marvin Vettori. Hear me out. I know you want to see Kamaru Usman maybe versus Shavkat. I think Kamaru Usman wants to stay at the middleweight division. He said it after UFC 294, and we need to get him ranked in this division. I think the UFC is going to want to fight or have Khamzat Chimaev fight the winner of Sean Strickland versus Dricus du Plessis, and there's no way in the world they can justify it. But now, if Kamaru Usman goes out there and beats Marvin Vettori, which I think he will, that will put him in the top 5 of the middleweight rankings, and Khamzat Chimaev does hold a win over him, so that will put Khamzat Chimaev in the top 5 of the middleweight rankings, justifying his title shot against Sean Strickland or Dricus du Plessis. That's how they're going to do it. Kamaru Usman is another guy that's a legend of the sport, done a lot for the sport that I have a lot of respect for, and he's a guy that deserves to be on UFC 300. I know Marvin Vettori isn't the most exciting opponent, but you can't take on Robert Whittaker or Paulo Costa because they just got booked for UFC 298 in Anaheim. And outside of that, I don't think they would do Usman versus Adesanya. So Usman versus Vettori makes a lot of sense. It arguably will justify the Khamzat Chimaev title shot. And yeah, that's what I got for you. So let's move on to the next fight. And I do think Jiri versus Rakic should probably be on the main card. That is a very, very solid fight. And I think Aljamain Sterling versus Calvin Kattar may even find itself on the prelims. I do want to make very clear, though, that this card might not be super realistic. I definitely went over the budget for what the normal UFC cards are, but this is UFC 300, and if Dana White says it's going to be very good from the first prelim to the main event, I'm going to have a fun time with it. These are some matchups that I think do make a lot of sense to put on a potential UFC 300 card, and it will be very expensive, but it will be a very fun time. So we're going to put Wonderboy Thompson versus Colby Covington. I know some people won't like this matchup because, oh, Colby Covington looked like ass. Have him take on Shavkat, have him take on a tough opponent. He's not going to do that. I think he made it very clear in his post-fight press conference that he's not going to do that. Wonderboy is a legend of the sport. Another one of these guys that I do believe deserves to be on a UFC 300 card. This is probably his retirement fight. Win, lose, or draw, he's not going to end up getting a title shot down the line. I know he loves to fight, but this is probably nearing the end of his career. He's 39 years old, maybe even 41. I don't know, somewhere in that range. Colby Covington called out Wonderboy Thompson. It's probably one of the few fights in the division he would take at this point in his career. I do think he would win this fight, and like I mentioned in my recent video about how to matchmake the welterweight division, if he goes out there and beats Wonderboy Thompson and Ian Gary goes out there and beats Jeff Neal, do Ian Gary versus Colby Covington and makes Ian Gary a massive name if he wins against Colby Covington and arguably gets him a title shot from that point forward. But yeah, Colby Covington, I do think out-wrestles Wonderboy Thompson, and he did apparently break his foot in the first 30 seconds against Leon Edwards. But who knows, because if you know Colby Covington, this guy has an excuse for every single time that he loses fights. Now let's move on to some other matchups, which is Cody Garbrandt versus Dominick Cruz 2. This fight makes all the sense in the world. I know Cody Garbrandt called out Davison Figueiredo. I don't want to see that. I think Figgy knocks him out in round 1. Figgy's got some very solid leg kicks, and if Brian Kelleher is having a lot of success on the feet with leg kicks against you, Figgy will be able to for sure. Figgy has landed some great leg kicks against Brandon Moreno, some other fighters as well. And yeah, I do want to say with Covington, we're going Covington by decision, but I'm not very confident about it because he really did have a very poor performance against Leon Edwards. Moving back to Cruz versus Garbrandt, I haven't even thought who I'm predicting about in this matchup. I cannot talk right now, geez. I don't know who I would be predicting in this matchup yet. Haven't really thought about it. I just know this is a matchup that I do want to see on this card, and this would be a very, very fun very, very fun rematch. Okay, we're going to talk a little bit slower so I can get this done right. Dominick Cruz is coming off a massive knockout loss against Marlon Vera where he took a lot of damage and potentially that fight altered his chin for the rest of his career. Cody Garbrandt has power in the hands and he can knock out Dominick Cruz. Now, what I don't like about Cody Garbrandt is he has very poor striking defense. Even against Brian Kelleher, he was getting his legs chewed up and he's swinging in and he's open to get countered. And he definitely has chin issues himself. Now, can Dominick Cruz knock him out? Yes. But I really would not count on it because we know Dominick Cruz does not have the greatest power in his hands. Very fun fight. I want to say I lean towards Dominick Cruz, but that Marlon Vera performance really can change his career. Not that he was going to be rushing up the rankings or anything like that, but just completely change his chin from here on out in his life performance, whatever it is. So Dominick Cruz, slight lean, not very confident. Cody can chin him. That's a pretty fun matchup in my opinion. It needs to be on UFC 300. It makes a lot of sense for this card. Let's move on to the next matchup that I have, which is Benoit Saint-Denis versus Beneil Dariush. Okay, I know people are going to say, do you want to see Beneil Dariush like dead? Not really. But my thing about Beneil Dariush is he says that he wants to take on the top competition. He doesn't want to go down and fight a layup fight, nothing like that. And in his or in an interview, I believe after he lost to Arman Tsarukyan, he mentioned Benoit Saint-Denis is what he said. BSD, Benoit Saint-Denis, as we all know him, as a potential matchup because he is a very, very solid opponent and is a new up-and-coming prospect. I think he probably chins Beneil Dariush in the first round, and the reason why the UFC would want to book this fight is because Benoit is an up-and-coming prospect who has a lot of fans from France and even in America because he has such a fun style, and he probably gets a very, very impressive performance done here. A very highlight reel knockout here, and builds his name a lot. So we'll go Benoit Saint-Denis, round 1 KO over Beneil Dariush. Fun, high-level fight. If Beneil is interested, I think this fight makes a lot of sense. Moving on to the next fight, I have Sterling versus Kattar here. I already talked about that one. So I will go to Tony Ferguson versus Jim Miller. I'm going with Tony Ferguson here. Whoa. No, I'm not. Sorry, I'm going with Jim Miller here. Sorry. Zoned out a little bit there. Tony Ferguson looked really bad recently against Paddy Pimblett. Unfortunately, his career needs to come to an end. I've seen a lot of people on Twitter talking about how this fight needs to happen on UFC 300. It makes a lot of sense. Retirement fight for both of these guys, no matter what. You book this fight. Jim Miller probably goes out there and beats Tony Ferguson at this point in his career, but he has a fight booked against Gabriel Benitez. Or maybe that's Michael Johnson. I think it's Jim Miller. Not entirely sure. I think Jim Miller goes out there and beats Tony Ferguson. He probably finishes him. But fight full of legends, some very solid names. Legends of the sport. Retirement fight, please. That's that. Moving on to the next fight that I have booked. Well, I'd put Joe Pyfer down. And this is just because Joe Pyfer seems like one of these guys that the UFC would like to have on these types of cards. Joe Pyfer is a guy that they seem to put a lot of promotional value into. So we're going to have him against one of 3 opponents, these being the winner of Imavov or Dolidze, or even Brendan Allen. And I know this is a very quick turnaround for Imavov, Dolidze, and even Joe Pyfer, but Joe Pyfer has been very active in the past, and I think a lot of fighters would look at the opportunity to fight on UFC 300 as a chance to build their name and just gain a lot of fans in the future, and that they would do a quick turnaround. Like an Imavov, Dolidze would build their name massively, even a Brendan Allen. Joe Pyfer, after his Dana White's Contender Series debut, it took him like less than 2 months to turn around, I believe. He is very active. You can entice a guy like him. If he beats Jack Hermansson, which is 2 months before UFC 300, to make a quick turnaround and then fight one of these 3 guys. Against Imavov, I don't want to predict that. That's 3 fights that I have to predict. But we'll see how Joe Pyfer does against Jack Hermansson. I think it would make sense to put him on this card, like I said. I think the UFC wants to put him there. They're putting a lot of promotional value into him, so this would make sense. Moving on to the next fight I have booked. It's Giga Chikadze versus Josh Emmett. Josh Emmett wanted to fight Max Holloway on UFC 300. We'll keep him on UFC 300 with a very fun fight. Giga Chikadze is a fun striker to watch. I'm leaning towards Josh Emmett. I originally was because he's got a very solid chin. He's got some very solid cardio, and Giga Chikadze doesn't really have that. If Josh Emmett connects, you will get hurt. And Giga Chikadze got hit against Calvin Kattar. He got hit against Alex Caceres. He hasn't looked fantastic lately, and he is very old and coming off a groin injury. And also, Josh Emmett can probably take this guy down and hold him there for some time, similarly to how Calvin Kattar did. Josh Emmett will be the pick. I don't know if I go with decision or knockout because Josh Emmett has so much power. He can knock out Giga, but Giga has such a very solid chin that I don't know. I probably will eventually go with Josh Emmett by KO, but I could see decision. You got to go with Josh Emmett here, in my opinion, seeing that he is coming off the groin tear. But I can't understand if you think Giga Chikadze has the tools to keep this at range and stay away from the power of Josh Emmett. That's understandable. Moving on to the next fight, we have Bobby Green versus someone. I have 3 potential opponents. I mean, you could pick whoever you want. First off, we have Paddy Pimblett. The UFC probably wants Paddy Pimblett's name to get bigger. This is a massive card. It makes a lot of sense. And this is going to be the worst version of Bobby Green within the rankings because Paddy Pimblett will now be taking on Bobby Green that took so much damage against Jalen Turner and may never be the same. Now, we could also do Bobby Green versus Michael Johnson. If Michael Johnson wins his fight, which is coming up on the upcoming card, Ankalaev versus Walker. And we could also do Bobby Green versus Jared Gordon too, because that was a very, very weird ending. Put Bobby Green on this card, another one of these guys that deserves to be on this card. Any of those 3 fights makes a lot of sense to me. And yeah, we'll move on to the next fight, which is actually the last fight that I will book/announce on this card. We finally made it here. I stuttered a lot throughout this video, but I'm just trying to get the content out. Sorry, guys. Sharapputin Magomedov versus Chris Curtis is going to be the last fight. If Chris Curtis goes out there and beats Marc-Andre Barriault, he will take a quick turnaround. He would love to be on UFC 300. And although, knowing Chris Curtis, he will probably cry about being on the prelims, I think he will kind of understand that this is UFC 300. If you don't know what I'm referencing to, he's been left off the main card of the pay-per-view before for some female fights, and he has, had a little rant on Twitter. So I'm just making some fun of him. Sharapputin Magomedov is a striker. Chris Curtis is a striker. I don't think Chris Curtis will be shooting takedowns knowing him. He likes to stand and bang, and I do think Sharapputin Magomedov is potentially the better striker. Now, can Chris Curtis knock him out? Chris Curtis is great at debunking the hype trains in the middleweight division. Phil Hawes, Brennan Allen. There's more that aren't coming to mind right now. But yeah, Sharapputin Magomedov is probably the pick I'm leaning right now because I think it will be a completely striking fight. And he maintains range very well. He's very defensively sound. And Chris Curtis isn't the greatest volume fighter. He's good at finding the greatest shots, and he is a little bit better as the fight goes late. But Sharapputin, defensively sound, pretty high output, got some good leg kicks. I overall do believe in his striking a lot, but just not his grappling or his jiu-jitsu. So yeah, that's going to conclude this video. Thank you guys for watching. Hopefully UFC 300 is this good. I don't know if they're going to book all these fights. I just think these are some fun fights you can put on the card. And if this was the card, I would be more than excited. I know there's some reality check, but when it comes to UFC 300, with the way that Dana White has been talking about it, and a lot of people throughout Twitter have been talking about it, I'm going to have fun with it. I'm going to dream a little bit. Yeah. Make some of these matchups. I think a lot of them make sense. Some of these are no-brainers, like Cruz Garbrandt, Tony versus Jim Miller. Obviously, Sterling versus Kattar was just booked. McGregor versus Chandler makes a lot of sense. Poirier versus Hooker, I wouldn't say is a no-brainer, but it makes a lot of sense. I think all these matchups make a lot of sense, although it might not be the fun title elimination ballots where there's like a Shavkat versus JDM / whoever, Gilbert Burns, whoever wins that fight. It's not like those type of fights, but it's these guys that are legends having some very fun fights, some big names on the card from start to finish, very entertaining as Dana White described. And I would have a lot of fun watching this card. So yeah, that's going to conclude this video. Thank you guys for watching so much. Make sure to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next one.